get us. Do places friend. In the deck, they don't have a prayer. That's why the sleeping strength body is haunting all my dreams. Everything's inside out, not as it seems. Oh, slide on in, magic little wicked queen. Come on, take a spin. The evil cannot get us. We'll take 'em on jackpot stakes. In boots on Saturday. King don't let's try to make it happen. Swing, don't miss in the wicked fight. Then we'll start to stroll. Sway and roll. Take control, yeah.
A subscribe button below the video and enjoy this podcast with Annie Jacobson. Mwah. Do you just start writing about something that's interesting and does it like evolve into this idea of a book? Or do you sort of pick what you want to write a book about and then go backwards, like reverse engineer it from there? Like, for example, with Area 51, like, what was the first thing that drew you into that story?
Yeah, a job. Like, I wanted a job. I wanted to write a book so badly. That was my first book. In the world of journalism, we call it long form, right? And who isn't dying to write a book? Look, it's the most amazing profession. I mean, not only do I write, which is just part of it, because I'm a nonfiction author and a reporter, I write about people that I interview. And so that part of it is extraordinary, just being able to get the stories out of these fascinating people. Stories out of these fascinating people. Interview of it, because I'm a nonfiction author and a reporter. I write about people that I part of it is extraordinary. Write a book. Look, it's the most amazing profession. Testing. Right, which is just part of it, because extraordinary that I just part of extraordinary that I just part of that I write, which is just the most amazing testing. Right, which is just part of because I'm a nonfiction author and a reporter, I write about people that I interview. And so that part of it is extraordinary, just being able to get the stories out of these fascinating people. And the way Area 51 came to me was the journalist lucky break. I was reporting, short form, right, where you're kind of like doing the 500-word articles. And I've been writing on terrorism because that's what was going on in the early 2000s. And there was let me get this straight. Okay, so I'm at a Christmas Eve dinner, and my husband's uncle's wife's sister's husband, who's an 87-year-old retired Lockheed guy.
Oh wow.
Okay, and I just think he's just this old man who designs, airplane windows, because that's kind of the role he always played. And he leans over to me at this Christmas dinner. We probably had 5 or 6 of them at that point, and says, "Boy, do I have a story for you." And, you think, okay, everybody thinks they have a story. And he said, "The CIA just declassified my life's work." And he was the physicist who created stealth technology for the CIA, starting when Eisenhower was president. So he worked on the U-2 and then on the A-12 Oxcart. And I'm like sitting there at this Christmas dinner like, what? Really? Literally they had just declassified all this. And then he started talking a little bit, and I said, and he was telling me about where they did all the testing of these aircraft, and I said, he was talking about how is this facility out in the desert called Groom Lake. And I was like, that's not Area 51 by any chance, is it? And he was like, oh yeah, they call it Area 51. And then that was my lucky break. That was really...
And that was before Obama declassified it?
Yeah, that was in 2009. And that's how you build a story, to answer that question. Like, you, as a reporter, I worked with Lovick and learned all about his story, and then said, when he would be talking about Ray Gowdy, the first test pilot on the U-2. Wait, is Ray around? Yeah, he's like 93, but he's still... And then you interview Ray Gowdy, and you find out what it was like to be the very first human being in a U-2. And then Ray says, oh, you got to talk to Wayne Pendleton, or oh, you got to talk to Bob Murphy. And so I put together 74 people who worked in and out of Area 51, and were all part of either Lockheed or the Air Force or the CIA. And the reason why the book was so secret, going back to the vault thing, was because no one had ever before had all those individuals go on the record, right? So, and when they were all talking to me, by the way, they would say Groom Lake or the ranch, but all these declassified documents, you could tell where the word Area 51 was redacted. They just, they declassified everything, and then, crossed out Area 51 with black. And out of, I don't know, probably several thousand pages of documents I reviewed, in one place they forgot to redact Area 51. And I put it up on my website. It was like brilliant. Yeah.
And did you just self-fund yourself? Did you fund yourself through all this? How long did it take you to write this?
Oh my God, I wrote Area 51, probably in, a year and a half. Yeah. And then I was also writing it for the Los Angeles Times Magazine. And I had sold a story about, Burbank, how Lockheed was so integral to the development of Burbank in the 50s. And, that's a suburb of LA.
Right.
And so they loved that story, and they did a 2-part series, and that led to it was coincided to come out right around the book, and so that allowed me to kind of balance, being a journalist. That was the transition from being a reporter who wrote magazine pieces and being an author. And since then, I just...
Whatever happened to sharing wealth among the people?
Now, the part in the book, like the last 14 pages of the book that talk about the Stalin aircraft with the beings, that was the reason that they kept it in a vault. And then what made him come to the decision to release this to the public?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's so interesting when you work with sources, because you and I spoke about this on the phone, right? Like, how do you trust someone?
Right.
How do you work with people and develop a relationship with them where they're telling you their role in history, right? So that's the Ed Lovick, the guy at the dinner party that was the physicist for Lockheed Skunk Works. The trust part of it comes from knowing someone is a real individual with a real job. They have a long-standing relationship, and there's multiple people that can vouch for them in that manner. And so that's what reporting is always about, and that's why a lot of people come to you from, friends of friends. And the one individual that you're asking me about in Area 51 that caused such a commotion, they all know him. All the people in the book know him. They're all part of the same group of people who, most of them are dead now. But this is how you put together a story, and it's always interesting too, public's reaction to that. How the public deals with people's legitimacy, and that's why as nonfiction authors, or at least in my position, all of my books are seriously footnoted. Like there'll be 400 pages of text and 100 pages of notes. But all of the books, as we spoke earlier before we started, I write about the CIA, I write about the Pentagon. All these projects, all these programs, all these hundreds of individuals, CIA operators, paramilitary operators, engineers, spies, servicemen, all of them, almost all of them at some point in the reporting history, tell me, Annie, I did what I did so we would prevent nuclear World War III. And that's why this new book I wrote, Nuclear War, A Scenario, is so significant for me in like a timeline of my work as an author, because there's this, like, once I knew I was going to write that book, it was like the most obvious moment of all. It was like, but of course, all of these other books have led up to this narrative, which frightens the hell out of me.
Yeah.
Even reading it, for the 100th time, right? I mean, what was your experience reading it?
I was terrified. I was terrified reading it. I had to put it down and go for multiple walks during the process of reading that book. And like I told you, I was listening to Christopher Nolan's movie soundtrack while I was reading the book, and it was like watching a movie in real life. I mean, you talk about nukes in all of your books.
Mm-hmm.
I never met
And
I did not like.
What I love about the new book is it's a fictional scenario, but it's also a real scenario. And I have so many questions, because it's not like you just go from place to place talking about events that happened. You're talking about a potential event that could happen. You're playing it out. A fictional, a scenario that could possibly happen, which makes that book so unique and so captivating to read. And
a small correction is that I wouldn't call the book fictional. I would call it
Right.
a fact-based
Yes.
scenario,
Yes.
right? Because everything that is reported in the book, I take you through what will happen from nuclear launch to nuclear winter.
Yes.
And the shocking part, as you now know having read it, is that this happens in seconds and minutes
Yes.
and hours,
Yes.
not months and years. I mean, nuclear winter itself, the part 5 of the book, is a longer part, but the war itself is 74 months, right? Because 72, because what I learned from the different sources that I worked with, and let me just say, 2 Secretary of Defenses, the head, a former STRATCOM commander, former nuclear subforce commander, the former director of FEMA, the person in charge of what to do with the public after nuclear war, which you learn is not much because, as he told me, everyone will be dead. Right? So I take the reader, and this was the shocking part, because when I approached it, one wondered, how will I do this, right? How does one keep it on point of fact and not go into, making things up? And the only things that are made up in the book are in italics, and that's the dialogue that, like, for example, the Secret Service director or the special agent in charge of the president's detail for the Secret Service will say to the cat team element, and that also comes from my interviews with those individuals when I would say, well, like, what would you say? And in some places, I'm able to quote a Secretary of Defense because he says, no, Annie, this is what I would say this, and give me a verbatim. That's when you see it's in quotes.
Right.
But otherwise, he says, well, this would be total chaos. This is called jamming the president when the STRATCOM commander is saying this, and the SecDef is saying this, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff is saying that, right?
Right.
The chairman.
That's what I love about it, because it's not told in like a third person. It's told as in like first person, you're there, it's happening now. That's what that's what really makes the book so gripping. Like it had me by the throat the whole time I was reading it. It was hard to put it down.
And also reporting that, finding out these individual places that exist where thousands of people are rehearsing what to do in nuclear war day in, day out, and have been doing this since 1945. This is the shocking part of it, learning about the aerospace data facility in Colorado that, by the way, was classified. Its existence was classified until 2008. That's where the data comes in from the satellite that sees the hot rocket exhaust on the ICBM as it launches in less than a second. So in a fraction of a second from the time that there would be a rogue launch. In my book, I use the North Korean scenario, right? Mm-hmm. A fraction of a second, the entire command and control, nuclear command and control system knows, holy shit, nuclear launch, right? And then it's just tick, 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 counting down what happens. And that should scare the hell out of everyone, because you don't really think of that anymore.
No, you don't.
We think, oh my God, the Cold War is over. People aren't, and yet in Ukraine you have situations where you have, the president of Russia talking about or alluding to maybe using a tactical nuke. These are you have, situations where people actually even contemplate this. Hopefully when they read the book they realize this is sheer madness. The idea of even using one nuclear weapon. All the war game scenarios in the Pentagon have showed us that once one is launched, it's the end game. Yes.
That was like probably the scariest revelation for me, because I don't think anybody knows that. No, I don't think anybody is by and large is aware that we have a rule that as soon as missiles launch heading towards us, we have to empty our arsenal. It's use it or lose it, at least for our ICBMs.
Use them or lose them. I mean, you can't even believe that when you hear that. But yet that is an actual nomenclature that is tossed around Washington. Mm-hmm. Same as, how about the bolt out of the blue attack? Right? When you learn these different strategies, launch on morning. I mean, for all the reporting I had done previously, 6 books prior, you hear sort of in passing, launch on morning, but you don't really know what that means until you drill down on it. And then you realize that we don't actually, the way in which the policy is set up, and again, this is explained to me point by point from former Secretary of Defense William Perry, right? Point by point, we do not wait to absorb a nuclear weapon. So once the satellite systems tell us, whoop, a nuke is on the way, launch on what was the policy. And
I didn't know this, but they launched them over the North Pole to go hit. If it is from North Korea, it has to fly over Russia to hit North Korea. And what are the chances that we can get Putin on the line in less than 6 minutes to tell them, hey, we got MIRV nukes coming over your continent of Siberia and Russia that are going for North Korea. They're not coming for you. They're going for North Korea. That is terrifying.
I mean, it's so terrifying, and it really is almost unbelievable. Like, okay, I mean, most people do not realize that. And even if you, when I had initially, there's a brilliant scientist called Hans Christensen who keeps track of all of the nuclear weapons and reports them with his colleagues in the Bulletin of Atomic Science. You know, it's called the Nuclear Notebook. And so he keeps track of all these things. And I did the interview with Christensen, and he's the one who said to me, absolutely, the nukes go over the North Pole if we're going to strike back at North Korea, let's say, if they, attack us.
Right.
And they have to overfly Russia. Right? And so you think to yourself, wait, is that really plausible? And when I did my interview with former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, who was also a former director of the CIA and was also a former White House chief of staff, okay? So he has been around in all these different positions. And he said to me, I'm paraphrasing, yes, the hole over the North Pole is a problem. You know, you just go, oh my God, right? Like, how can this kind of existential, like, mayhem, potential apocalyptic mayhem exist every second of every day of every year? And it does. And we just are kind of living with this sword of Damascus over our heads.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, okay, well, and I mean, the book is terrifying, but I hope that it brings to the table a discussion about all of this. Like, it's not something that is wise. And it's certainly not something, when you look at the former president, the whole fire and fury with North Korea, it's like, that just seems so reckless once you know how fundamentally perilous all of this is.
Yeah, you said it great in the Pentagon's Brain book. You said every man, woman, and child has the sword of Damocles dangling over their head by the thinnest of strings.
Yeah.
And it could be cut at any moment by accident or by a miscommunication.
And that was Kennedy's quote.
Oh, that was Kennedy's quote.
That was
Wow.
Kennedy's quote. He's such an interesting president. I've looked at all the presidents. I always stay out of politics. No one has any idea, how I vote. And I have just as many readers on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
It's so I'm so in favor of that because it's
nothing you write about is opinion. It's all real document. It's all real documentary. It's all like nothing you're writing is your opinion.
And people then form their own opinions.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So I'm going to tell you an anecdote about that because when I wrote Operation Paperclip about the Nazi scientists who came to America after the war, my editor really taught me. I had a position that was the closest I was coming to an opinion, right? And my editor, wise that he is, suggested that I thread in some more of the concept of, that many people believed if these Nazis didn't come to America, we'd all be speaking Russian. Okay, so that was necessary to win the Cold War. And I did that. And when the book came out, I mean, that was 2013, so journalists could still appear on CNN and Fox News back-to-back nights. I mean, that would never happen now, which is tragic, in my opinion. But you could be on both because I was just I just had an interesting story that lots of people were really interested in. And when I would be in the more conservative environments, people would say, oh my God, Annie Jacobsen, thank God you wrote this book, Operation Paperclip. You showed us that if we didn't hire these guys, we'd all be speaking Russian. And then I would go over to the more liberal organizations, the news organizations, and they would say, "Oh my God, Annie Jacobsen, you wrote this book, Operation Paperclip, and man, did you show us that hiring those Nazis was the worst, most odious, undemocratic thing we ever did. I mean, thank you so much for writing this book."
They're both wrong.
What do you think?
I don't know. I think well, they're both right and they're both wrong, right? I think that we had it was either get those scientists or let the Russians get the scientists. Like it's the game theory thing, right? It's the prisoner's dilemma.
Prisoner's dilemma.
The same thing with nuclear war. Like, let's just say, let's prosecute them all, send them off to prison, execute them, and let's hope that the Russians do the same exact thing. Or do we take all their science? I mean, it's what's fascinating. Like, one of the things that blew my mind about Operation Paperclip was that these people like Werner von Braun, is it von Braun? You call him von Braun.
I mean, there's so many different pronunciations. I just try to stick to one pronunciation, but I'm of the. I remember we had a president who said Pakistan, and we had a Secretary of State who said Pakistan.
Oh, okay.
So, right? You
Right.
can say whatever. It's just transliteration.
So after Hitler enacted that scorched earth policy where what happened? They destroyed all the infrastructure in Germany, all the dams, all the bridges, everything, kind of like what they did in Rome. Von Braun and some other high-ranking Nazi scientists were basically like sitting in a mansion eating caviar because they knew that the Russians or the Americans needed them badly, and they had a future with the U.S. Army or with the Russians.
Absolutely. And what was so interesting reporting that book was looking at documents in the National Archives, right? Looking at the files. So once they became part of the American national security apparatus, they had files on them. But then their past, like sort of what they were doing in World War II, was all done from interviews, right? So you have to take into consideration that these were Nazis saying what they did, under interrogation as opposed to seen through a different lens. I went to Germany and looked at the Bundesarchives, and they had a lot of different kind of records that were fascinating. I mean, I had a German translator with me, and so I was able to report, I think, more of the story than had existed on the record, although there's some incredible journalists that came before me that were working in different veins of the individual scientists and things, and I definitely stand on their shoulders, but definitely was able to get some original reporting on the record, including a lot of this sort of the capture mode, right? And right before the war ended that you're talking about, where these Nazis knew that the war was going to end not in their favor. And they wanted to work for the Americans. They knew they were valuable, and they did not want to go work for the Russians because they hated one another, the Russians and the Germans. Hated one another. And in fact, we know from the declassified documents that the Germans, the Nazi scientists who did wind up in Russia, were treated like garbage.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they had a program. There's a whole CIA file on this I found at the National Archives, where the CIA was like, what do they have? Who do they have? And what are they doing? And so we were constantly trying to get intel. And this is, of course, all pre-U2, so it all kind of threads together. This is, we didn't know anything. We didn't know what was going on in the aftermath of the war in Russia in those first few years. And so the CIA was hunting for information, and the best information they could get was a couple years after the war ended. The Russians kind of got all they could, or all they thought they could, from the German rocket scientists, and then just sent them home. And we called the program, the CIA called the program Operation Dragon Return. That's what it was called. And we had CIA officers, interviewing the Germans as they were being brought back to try to say, like, what did you tell the Russians? And it was interesting because the Russian rocket program was actually superior to the American program in the early 50s, and of course they got Sputnik, and absolutely, they launching Sputnik required essentially a ballistic missile. And so there's a really complex argument that, wait a minute, maybe those Nazi scientists weren't so great, because the Russians, who were working from almost nothing, given what, their country was destroyed, and yet they were able to build up their rocket program. So there's an argument that if American rocket scientists had been moved to the fore, they would have been just as excellent as the von Brauns. But still, having interviewed two of the men on the moon, two astronauts, Apollo astronauts, as I have, Ed Mitchell and Buzz Aldrin, both who, in our discussions and our interviews, are so enamored with the German scientists they can simply not think of them as former Nazis.
Really?
I mean, so,
what
this
does
is
it mean to be a Nazi? That's a good question. That was in your book.
Well, what do you think it means to be a Nazi?
I don't know. I'm not qualified to answer. I think, I found it interesting, the story of, I think her name's Hannah Arendt,
Yeah.
where she talks about, she had a lover, she was Jewish, and she fell in love with a Nazi. And she had basically what she talked about, breaking down good and evil. Like, it's not, she was saying that there's so much nuance. Like, the guy that she was in love with was the guy who was like in charge of the transportation with the trains or whatever. And she was like, this guy has never had a coherent thought go through his mind. He's not a thinker, right? You say that, how do evil people sleep at night? Well, they sleep great because they don't have a conscience. And this guy was just sort of following rules, right? You just sort of have people who aren't thinkers that just follow the rules and get through the day. And that was what she was saying about the guy she fell in love with. Like, this guy is not inherently evil. Like, he's not a killer. He's not a Hitler. But he was born in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he was following the rules. That was her argument.
Well, obviously I didn't interview any Nazis, so I only interviewed the children of Nazis. And so my perspective comes from, like, the reverse engineering of the crime, right? The massive genocide. And so when one looks at history like that, your lens is focused on evil, right? So I can't think of it any other way. And also, I am someone who does believe in forgiveness, right? So that's a whole other complex situation. And I have interviewed many people who have had a very guilty conscience, and I have borne witness to that, right? And it's a very human situation. It's profound, okay?
What's up, guys? I'm super psyched to introduce to you another product that I've been using for years now that was also recommended to me by the world-renowned nutritional scientist, Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, and it is called Keto Brains. Keto Brains Nootropic Creamer is a way to perfectly dial in your morning beverage to bring you razor-sharp focus on demand. I start out every day with Keto Brains in my cup of coffee to combat the midday slump, and I use it for pre-workout. Keto Brains Nootropic Creamer has efficacious doses of focus-inducing alpha-GPC, lion's mane, alpha wave promoting L-theanine, and ketone-stimulating C8-MCT powder. And all of those high-functioning nootropics are packed into a delicious, creamy coconut powder. It tastes amazing, it's a keto nootropic powerhouse, and it tickles all the right neurotransmitters to give you the flow and jitter-free energy with absolutely zero crash. There's no dosage tricks involved. It's just one scoop is a full serving. You can put it in your coffee, your tea, put it in your water, whatever you want, and you get 30 full doses per package. There's no pills, and there's absolutely no waiting for it to kick in like that. You can keep your brain razor sharp, primed, and ready for action with Keto Brains Nootropic Creamer. Whether you're an entrepreneur juggling multiple projects, a student studying for exams, or you're an athlete that's trying to optimize your training, Keto Brains will not let you down. All right, here, I'm gonna list all the ingredients contained in Keto Brains and what they do. It increases ketone production via AG C8-MCT powder. It increases Dan's main, literally, and get a big Dan promo code
Shocking.
20 at checkout. Back to the show.
What I found shocking was reading and studying all these Nazis through their files, through their interrogations, and then also looking at those who kind of became heroes in America, right? And sort of had buildings named after them and became part of the American, way of life. Never once did any single one of them ever, anywhere, ever, in any document, be it their private files or their public, interviews, did they ever express remorse. Ever. And that says something to me. Any document did any and became part of the American, way of sort of had buildings at those who kind of became heroes in interrogations. And then also looking at those who Nazis. What I found shocking was reading and studying all these Nazis through their files, through their interrogations. And then also looking at those who kind of became heroes in America, right? And sort of had buildings named after them and became part of the American, way of life. Never once did any single one of them ever, anywhere, ever, in any document, be it their private files or their public, interviews, did they ever express remorse. Ever. And that says something to me.
What do you think that is?
Denial. Right? And to be able to, look your new employer in the eye and say, I was not a Nazi. The only people in my establishment who were Nazis was the janitor. When it's just simply not true. You yourself were a Nazi. Everyone you hired was a Nazi. The book was that book was so meaningful to me. And it's when you write and you write about really dark things, there is, at least my style, is like, how much do you show your reader, okay? Right? So, in other words, in the nuclear war book, it's meant to terrify you, and yet it's all mechanical, right? I do describe what happens to people when they are incinerated, because I learned that information from declassified Atomic Energy Commission documents, okay? And it is horrific, right? People turning into combusting carbon, right? But it's scientific, and so it's like frigidly cold horror as you're reading it, right? You with your soundtrack in your mind, but very different from that. At the other end of the spectrum is the horror of World War II. And so, but I knew when I was writing Paperclip that if I was too descriptive, people might have to put the book down, because people can only handle so much. But I needed to know it. And so I went to Dachau, and I met with the lead archivist.
What is Dachau for people listening who might not know?
Dachau is the concentration camp, one of the first, and it was in Germany, unlike Auschwitz, which was in Poland. And it's where a lot of medical experiments took place. Gruesome medical experiments, the freezing experiments. That the aircraft, the people who were involved in aircraft engineering and the doctors that were working, that then ended up coming to America. This is where they all sort of, that was their laboratory, right? They experimented on prisoners, okay? They killed them, right? And you could distance yourself by having it be your, that guy, your student doing the work, right? But I hold them all accountable. These are those who came to America and became our heroes. But in any event, at Dachau, I asked the archivist to show me the actual photographs, and they have them there. And I saw them, and I will never forget. I mean, the look. What I remember, I can remember the look in the. A series of photographs of someone living, and then dying, being frozen to death. And or in an altitude chamber, a decompression chamber, I mean, just horrific, but I had to see that so that I could forcefully write that narrative. And
Maximum ammo equals
it taught
How are they freezing them?
the freezing experiments. They had a big, and there are some famous photographs of them, some that are also available online now, but they had a big, like, you know, almost like a blow up pool, right?
Sam, you gotta play a little bit more aggro. Listen, bro, big on Mass and Key. You can't play aggro like a controller player. You can't. Because if you play aggro, not only is Mass the worst input, but you're also gonna be playing against the controller players with the better input close up. You cannot play as aggro as controller players in this game if you're Mass Key. You cannot. At Mass and Key, you have to like sit back a little more and play like a little bit smarter.
And they had ice water in it. And And the idea, the Nazi experiments, they were not just doing them to be cruel per se, right? The idea was they needed pilots to fly higher, faster, and further. Okay, so, and then when you would get shot down in the North Sea, you would freeze to death. And so they needed to know how, the Reich needed to know how long can a pilot survive in freezing water before we can rescue him. And they wanted to know that, like, oh, do we send our resources out to get this guy? It's been XYZ amount of time. And so they tested how long someone could live before they froze to death on concentration camp prisoners, and like young men who were the same age as pilots, you know.
You know, I know this is a terrible comparison, but I was watching this video online this morning of these, what they call them nuclear veterans.
The atomic soldiers.
The atomic soldiers. These kids were like 18, 19 years old. They put them on ships and they would put them out where they drop bombs, where they drop nukes. They told them, turn around, just don't look at the flash, cover your face like this, face the other way. And these people said they could see the x-rays of their hands through their closed eyes when the flash came through. And they had to deal with, their children were born with like crazy diseases that they were like dying early and stuff. Like it was, that's on par with some of this shit.
Yes. I mean, it's so complex because, again, you know, we had the Nuremberg trials, we had the doctor's trial.
Yeah.
You know, to set the gold standard of what can never be done to a human. And then we turned around and did many of those same things. The Atomic Energy Commission absolutely did. I mean, this is on the record now. In the name of, you know, we must prevent nuclear World War III. There you go. So, but if it does happen, we have to know how it's going to affect people. I mean, the atomic soldiers, there were those on ships, and there were also those in the desert in Nevada when we were setting off bombs, because they wanted to see how they, being the Defense Department, wanted to see how soldiers would perform in nuclear battle. They wanted to see how they would perform physically and also psychologically, right?
They said that some of the people were there on the boat, like crying for their mothers after that flash went off.
But, you know, the flip side of that, too, is then there's Billy Waugh, right? Okay, so we segue to Billy Waugh, who actually, you know, Billy...
We are all over the place in this podcast. We are not staying...
But, you know,
sorry, this is going to be an interwoven discussion of all of the books at once. This is not going to be a segmented chapter of one book after the other. So that's okay.
But Billy Waugh was part of a green light team who jumped a handheld nuke into actually it wasn't Area 51, but it was near Area 51, into the Nevada test site, you know,
right.
And multiple people, you know, Billy told me this amazing story. It's in the book Surprise, Kill, Vanish that I wrote about the CIA's paramilitary. And, you know, many people are like, how do you know, because that's what we call a single source story, right? It's just Billy who told me that, right? And when I report a story that is a single source, I make it clear that it's, you know, what is being said is in quotes, right? But when I was researching nuclear war, the new book, I worked with Los Alamos was very, very helpful to me.
Wow.
And very transparent and really interesting. And I think a lot of it had to do with the Oppenheimer film, right? They realized that public awareness of things is significant, right? Information is king. But they confirmed the Billy Waugh. One of the librarian historians are confirmed the Billy Waugh story.
The briefcase nuke.
Yes, which was just like, amen, you know?
Yeah, that was a crazy story. Back to Paperclip, though. So, can you explain this Otto Ambrose character?
I mean...
And didn't you interview his family?
I did. Ambrose, to me, was pure evil, right? I mean, he worked for IG Farben, it was the chemical company who, you know, made Zyklon B and all kinds of other, you know, chemicals. And Ambrose was part of the chemical weapons scientists that were of great interest to the United States. But more than anything that was shocking to me was that I found in the National Archives the receipt, and this had never been reported before, of a 1 million Reichsmarks bonus that Adolf Hitler gave to Otto Ambros to thank him for his work. 1 million Reichsmarks. That's how important he was to Adolf Hitler himself. And Ambros was tried and convicted at Nuremberg of mass murder and slavery because he was in charge of the chemical element of the chemical factory. There was a rubber plant at Auschwitz called Buna, and most people don't even know about this. I didn't know about this before I reported paper. But Buna was where the young men, the young Jewish, concentration camp prisoners who, get off the trains, go that way to be gassed. Oh, you're a young man that's 18 years old and you look healthy. Let's work you to death over at Buna, building rubber for the Reich. Because they needed, tanks, and, the tanks needed treads.
Didn't they develop synthetic rubber?
Yes.
Weren't they the first ones?
That was
to do
Ambros.
that?
That
was Ambros.
That's why they got the million in his team, yes. And he was in charge of the plant there. And then on the flip side of that, I interviewed Gerhard Marschowski, who was an actual Buna survivor, right? So he was 18 years old. And he was picked coming off the train. And, it's like he was in his 90s when I interviewed him, and he described to me how when he was leaving quickly, of course people didn't know they were getting on a train to go to Auschwitz. Auschwitz, they just knew they had to leave quickly from their home. And he put on his best boots, like his sturdiest boots. And those boots saved his life because he could work and walk through the frozen, soil to this Buna factory that was just so, it was a death camp. It was a work to death camp as opposed to gas you to death. And Otto, the records that I found in Germany that describe Ambros, a few days before the Russians liberated Auschwitz, knowing the Russians were near, and Otto Ambros rapidly gathering up all his papers so that he wouldn't be, caught for the criminal, the war criminal that he was, and then leaving on a fancy train. And the fact that we were interested in him and hired him is just. It's horrifying. And I mean, remember, he was convicted at Nuremberg, and he was in Landsberg prison, and then a kind of deal was made to let the prisoners out. Because, there was a new war, now we're in the late 50s or the mid 50s, and it's time to get over what happened in Germany. And that's one of the conditions for the Germans to be our partners, the West Germans, was to release all the prisoners from Landsberg. And that's why Otto Ambros, was released. And then he, it's very mysterious in what capacity he worked for us. But he did work for us because he has a paper file. And there are, there's entry and exit visas and nothing else, right? It's just all been obfuscated. The story is waiting to be told. More of it. I told what I could in paper clips, they even gave him his villa back. They gave him his Swiss villa.
Is that where his family lives now?
Yes, and it's complicated because I reached the son, and he got all the money, and it was
living in a house that was paid for by Hitler.
I mean, it was a very contentious conversation, and it was like, do not call me anymore, and you know, I even pursued that, and I remember being told by one of my attorneys, like, Annie, they have different laws in Germany for stalking. Like, you know, because a reporter can kind of really, you know, you can become a bit like a pit bull with a bone, especially in a situation like that, you know.
You really wanted to talk to him.
I really wanted to know.
Did you consider just showing up at his house?
That's what I was going to do, and I was just advised against it. Like, not advised, like told, like,
Right.
don't do that.
Bad
you know?
idea. Who else did you talk to then when you went there?
Well, Dr. Blum. So if you Google Kurt Blum,
Yeah,
or Blum,
you can
how
find a
it's
photo of
pronounced.
him and
Yeah.
Kennedy and Johnson. You should find that, Steve.
No,
It's
no, no.
incredible.
That's Debus. That's
Oh,
Kurt,
that's
That's
Debus.
Kurt Debus.
Okay,
That's
okay.
He was. I mean, he, you know, Blum was the Reichsgesundheitsführer. That was his German title, and that means the Deputy Surgeon General of the Third Reich. Okay, and he was in such close proximity to Hitler. He wore the Golden Party badge. It's this little pin that meant he had favor with the Fuhrer. Right? And he planned, oh God, the documents I found in the Bundesarchiv, they were just murderous, you know. Dr. Kurt Blum is his name. There he is, up there on the left, right?
Top left.
Yeah. And he has that dueling scar.
Yeah, they all had those dueling scars.
But I found these documents where he talks about giving Sonderbehandling, that's the German term, to, you know, like, I think it was 10,000 or maybe it was 18,000 tubercular Poles, like Polish people with tuberculosis. And Sonderbehandling means special treatment. And that's the way that a reporter unwinds, like, oh, that's a euphemism for death. Because he's writing these documents I found, he's writing back and forth to Himmler, you know, we should just give them Sonderbehandling, special treatment. And Himmler saying, yes, but the parents might want, or the family members might wonder, you know, so they're deciding to kill masses of people. And when I went to speak with Kurt Blum's son, who had never done an interview until we did an interview, who was just a remarkable human being, like, amazing, you know, just,
What was he like?
oh my God. I mean, he had been a doctor, and he's like, for as evil as his father looks, he looks kind and gentle, and is, right? And he writes books, and he'd given up his traditional medical career to treat people with Bach flowers.
What is this for?
What's a
Right?
Bach?
Like Bach is like, it's like a Bach flower. It's like almost like aromatherapy.
Oh, okay.
Right? So it's like holistic medicine. And it's this incredible human irony that this Kurt Blum's primary job and why he was interesting to the Defense Department, the War Department, was that he was working on a bubonic plague bomb for Hitler. Literally. I mean, the documents are all there. He was developing a plague bomb for Adolf Hitler.
Jesus Christ.
He was in charge of the biological warfare program. And that he was trying to kill people, you know, that way, and his son was trying to cure people with flowers, is this remarkable irony. And it's just endlessly interesting. And you know, America being a country where, like, everyone seems to have, like, father issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you go and just to have met the young Dr. Blum, and you kind of put yourself in his moccasins and you imagine, I mean, he had no contact with his father.
Never met him.
No, he met him and all of that, but, like, after the war, I mean, you know,
He just abandoned him after the war.
yeah, they just went, you know, Kurt Blum's wife, Bettina Blum, was Germany's, let me get this right, she was Germany's most famous novelist. Like, I think it was even romance novels, like in the 30s, right? They were this dashing couple, you know, and it was interesting because he was kind of like an epic figure in German medicine before, you know, the Reich took over.
Hitler.
And he he transformed, you know. He became a nationalist. He became a fascist. He wrote books sort of at the cusp of National Socialism in 1933. And it's just, I could just go on forever
What do you write books about?
about being a doctor. About being a doctor, right?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting thing about these scientists like him and von Braun and Otto Ambros is their career or their profession is takes precedent, and any sort of evil that will help propel them, no matter good or evil, no matter what it is, they're willing to go with it as long as it propels what they're interested in.
And that's the great conundrum, because, you know, of like, how far do you go with pushing science, and where are the lines of morality, you know, and what is a human capable of when they swallow the Kool-Aid about a certain ideology? You know, that is the fundamental question at the heart of every book I have ever written, because that question gets raised by many members of elite military forces that I have interviewed. So, you know, how do you walk that line? How do you, you know, at what point is there a no? And usually there isn't. And usually, like, I found one of the most interesting things at Area 51 is how when I reported Area 51 is when I learned what need to know actually is, right? And it's a very, you know, sort of innocuous situation at Area 51 in terms of developing planes. Like, somebody in one room is working on the engine, and in another room they're working on the windshield wipers, okay? And you don't know for what. It's like that myth of 4 people feeling an elephant, and one of them thinks it's a tree trunk, and one of them, you know, thinks it's a rope.
It's the compartmentalization.
Right? Yes. And so that is also that's how a system of systems works, right? And that's the same with the nuclear war industry. It's, you're just working on a piece of the action, you know.
Going back to real quick to when you were in Germany and you were interviewing his son, didn't he give you a bunch of stuff to take home?
Yeah. You know, I went there and it was like, it was like a moment. I mean, he opened the door and said, you know, I've been waiting for you to come. Like, it was like a as a metaphor, like, finally, right? Because there was a kind of catharsis about him, at least I felt, speaking, you know. What was interesting is he said, I will tell you everything I know about my father, but you have to tell me everything you know. And I had just come from the archive with my German PhD, brilliant, you know, historian translator who was working with me and reading these Dr. Kurt Blom Reichsgesundheitsführer documents about the Sonderbehandling, about the special treatment, about killing tubercular Poles. And the younger Dr. Blum asked me to explain that to him, what I knew of his father, and I did, you know, with the reporter's hat on. But you also have this feeling of like, oh God, you know, it's like, it's the person's father, right?
Right.
Rifle in hand,
And
I will defeat all who stand in
so
my way.
then he told me everything that, you know, he shared with me, what he knew of his father, and that's in the book, in Operation Paperclip. And then when I was leaving, he said, I have these books. He had like this incredible collection of books, you know, incredible. And like I said, he had written, I think he's written 6 or 8 books. And none of which deal with, you know, political issues or anything, just about being a human and about being a doctor and about, you know, homeopathic medicine. But he said, I have something for you. You know, I want you to read these. And he pulled these books down. And he gave them to me. And I realized, looking at them, and they had wrappers on them, and they actually had exhibit number such and such from the Nuremberg
Real
trials.
challenge.
And I was like, oh my God, I can't, I thought he wanted me to take them back to my hotel room and read them. And I said, he said, no, I don't. I want you to have them. I want you to have them. I don't want them. And you should have them. And I do have them. And I have them. And I think about that. And I look at them sometimes. Because, what Blum did at the Nuremberg trial is extraordinary in its
I will guard this with my life.
mental sort of screws with your head, right? So Blum was so smart and crafty. He was at the doctor's trial before he worked, before he became part of the paperclip, and he got it. He and his wife Bettina were still together, and she kind of worked with his attorney, and they found documents to demonstrate that American doctors were experimenting on prisoners during the war. And they caught the prosecution completely off guard during the Nuremberg trial. Like, if you read these manuscripts of this, the doctor's trial is this shocking trial, and many shocking things happen, but that is like, the prosecution was stunned. It was like, they didn't know what to say. Like, did we really do this? And we did. And that blew the argument against Blum, and he was acquitted.
Wow.
He was
What were
acquitted.
we doing to prisoners, and where?
I mean, and then this gets you all. I mean, then it just kept going through MK Ultra and everything. But
Area 51 stuff?
Yes, we were experimenting on prisoners, and we were, it has to do with testing. Again, testing, penicillin, testing degrees of sickness, and it was part of the war effort. And so it became, and he became so cynical, like in his post-trial interrogations and discussions with his handlers, all of which I read and I write about in Operation Paperclip. He's so cynical, and it's really creepy because he has a point, which doesn't excuse any of his murderous behavior, but he does have a point about hypocrisy, and it's just frightening and spooky in its complete
I do not
factual
like this feeling of
reality.
being surrounded.
Have you ever seen the show
Now I have reason
based
to be
on
angry.
P.K. Dick's book? It's called Man in the High Castle.
I haven't seen it yet. It's on the list. Yeah.
It's incredible. It really, you can read history, you can go to the lengths that you did, watch the videos, but the way they did that show,
I will deal with you
and
all.
how they show what would happen if the Nazis would have taken over America, and all the symbolism everywhere, the beautiful all the emblems, flags in
branding.
the yard, the branding was ungodly. One of the top guys was an American. This is a little problem, so I'll just ruin this. One of the top guys who was an American ends up, joining the Nazis. And down the road, he was one of the top guys, one of those evil guys, right? He becomes just pure evil. Then his son goes in for a physical, and they find out his son has some sort of neurodegenerative disease, and his son has to be euthanized. And that's the sort of spiral you watch him go down, the father. It is just, it's gut-wrenching. It is just so gut-wrenching, and then to read your book and hear about all the euthanization they were doing on
Yeah.
people with disease or people with mental problems or whatever it may be. It was just,
It's just
makes you want to throw up. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you would do if you had an extra hour in each day? Would you go for a walk? The question is that speaks me to help you use it, and BetterHelp
Then
GLP.com/Danny Jones. It's linked below. Now back to the show.
Then you fast. Okay, so the outcome of Blum, he's acquitted at Nuremberg, and then we hire him, and we know that he's such a hot potato, right? And his name is so public, right? I mean, one of the most shocking things is all these Nazis came to America under their own names. They did not have pseudonyms. But Blum, and you see this in his intelligence, in his file, the handlers were like, we can't really bring you to America yet. We kind of have to, cool it, so we'll put you at one of our facilities in Germany, because we occupied Germany. And they put him, Blum, at this place called Camp King, where he was the doctor. And I write this at length, and I'm still shocked that this hasn't gotten more attention. Because Camp King was the original black site. And it was run by the military and the CIA. And Camp King, as I report in the book, was where the program that became known as MK Ultra began, right? Originally it was called Bluebird and then Artichoke. And this is where we were testing drugs on
Wait, I thought we had
prisoners.
a deal, boss.
And
What year?
it began I went there. I went to
Oh,
to
really?
Camp King. Yeah.
Bear if he hears
Yeah.
click, click.
Haus Waldorf. They
Okay, first interrogation center for
Yeah.
the German Air Force.
And so there was a horrible, evil Nazi named Reinhard Gehlen, and he had been in charge of for Hitler. He'd been in charge of, Eastern Front intelligence. So he collected intelligence on the Soviets. So of course we wanted him after the war. So he was set up at his own facility down the road from Camp King, and Gehlen would grab
What happens
individuals
when we
who
recover
he said
other
were
things?
Soviet spies.
Maybe
Okay,
Richtofen
I mean,
will
my
tell
God,
us
he
of
was
his
just settling
plans.
scores half the time. We know that now, right? And say, oh, this guy's a Soviet spy. Essentially torture him with these radical new drugs you're working on, and let's see what we can learn. And so, all of the early programs to see how much morphine you could give someone before their head exploded, how much, this was all going on.
At the worst possible time.
And Dr. Blum was the doctor. Dr. Blum was the doctor there. I mean, and that is original reporting for me from Paperclip. Followed by his arch nemesis, who to me is the most important, one of the most interesting people in Operation Paperclip, Dr. Walter Schreiber, who was the Surgeon General of the Reich, not the deputy, but the Surgeon General. And he was one of the most odious human beings imaginable. And it's just like, I don't want to spoil his story of what he did and how his outcome was, because you got to read Paperclip. But that he winds up in Texas, eating cheeseburgers and living the American dream, is just mind-boggling. And how he winds up, I mean, it's worth a read, right? And also he's one of the only Paperclip scientists who gets exposed and expelled. He had to leave.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he had to leave.
How did he get exposed?
He got exposed by Leo Alexander, who was had been in charge of finding out. He was an American Jew who was a psychiatrist who was sent to the ruins of the Reich to find out who to hang, right? Find doctors to prosecute. And so, on the one hand, you had him pursuing who to hang, and he's up against the guys who are secretly figuring out who to hire. Right? Wow. It was this wild conundrum, and Leo Alexander didn't know. He didn't know. He was the chief investigator for the doctor's trial. And he didn't realize that there was this other program until much later, until the 50s, when he found out Schreiber was living in America. And then
Wasn't there... Which one of them was, like, the top guy at Kennedy Space Center at what point?
that was Debus.
That
Kurt
was
Debus.
Okay, that was Davis.
That was
okay.
Debus, who wore, I found in his file, these little tidbits that a reporter kind of gets to put on the record for the first time become a little bit of a badge of honor. And I don't think it had been ever reported before that Kurt Debus wore his Nazi Reich uniform to work at Peenemünde, where he worked. Like, that was not required. You could go
At where?
At Peenemünde, which is in Germany, where they were building the rockets,
okay,
right?
okay.
But he wore, out of pride.
He worked at Kennedy Space Center. I was like, what?
No. Out of pride, he wore his Nazi suit to work back during the war, right? And he also turned in a fellow scientist who wouldn't give him the Hitler salute.
Wow.
Right? And that guy went to the Gestapo, picked him up, and that guy was, taken off, right? So Kurt Debus was a hardcore Nazi, right? Like an avowed Nazi. And, you know, you look at pictures of him with that dueling scar, which was the mark of the elite, you know. But
That was such a weird thing that the Nazis did. Like it was almost like they didn't even need to have the sword fight. They could just cut each other's cheeks open, and you
Yeah.
would get the job done. Because it seemed like they just all wanted that
they
scar.
wanted the scar. And of course, it began earlier, you know, and then it was outlawed for a while. And then the Nazis, you know, when they were younger, they brought it back. It meant you were at one of these elite universities. And they would sometimes, and it was interesting because, of course,
Steven, can you find some examples, some photos of them?
many of them would become, you know, doctors themselves, but they would, when you'd have a slice in this duel, then they would pack the wound with horsehair to make it more pronounced, because that was a sign of, you know, sort of prowess.
Who was that? Is that Von Braun on the top left? No.
No, that's Skorzeny. He was like
okay.
he was kind of like an
I am
operator
popular
for.
with the hell pigs.
Yeah. Yeah, they all have them, and they're all in like almost the same exact spot too.
the chief. You know, it's so interesting to look back through the lens of history and think, like, when you see those photographs now of the president, you know, standing there with these hardcore Nazis,
Yeah.
and you just, but
Oh God! Look at that guy. He's bleeding all over the place.
Perhaps I am immune.
Sorry. So, yeah, what were you saying about looking through the lens of history?
you know, I mean, it's just Paperclip is infinitely interesting also because that is where the buildup of, you know, again, tying it back to nuclear war. Like, the V2 was the precursor to the ICBM, which now carries nuclear warheads from anywhere in the world, one side of the world to the other, in, you know, 26 minutes, 30 minutes, 33 minutes, right? That's where it all began. And the incredible fast-paced march of science in this tiny period of time from 1943, 4, 5, you know, till now. It's just remarkable. And it seems to me, because I write about war and weapons, that all of this military technology comes down to this very interesting concept of dualism. You have that which can harm and that which can not necessarily heal, but can advance, right? You know, all of the internet, right? That we have the internet, or that we have computers. I mean, it's just remarkable to think that this has all happened in our world in the past since World War II.
You know, you have to wonder too, what kind of technology did the Nazis have that we might not know about? Like, what was it? Was there anything that was not declassified? You know, you talk about, there's a scientist named Rydell, I think his name was, who was obsessed with
He was
flying
obsessed
to
with
the moon.
UFOs, yeah.
Oh,
he was also obsessed
UFOs?
with UFOs. Oh my God, he was a real sore in a thorn in the side of the government because he came here and he joined a UFO club.
Oh, really?
And then he and his friends were doing UFO hoaxes. I write about this in Area 51 because it was really interesting. Like, you know, most of them kind of stayed in line and were really interested in towing the, you know, the line of democracy and then, you know, advancing their careers. That really was the Nazis were nothing if the former Nazis were nothing if they weren't ambitious. But a few of them ran into, you know, trouble, and Rydell was one of them because the government did not like that he was really interested in UFOs. And yeah, I mean, we could talk for days about the UFO conundrum,
Yeah,
but
we could. What, didn't the Horton brothers come from Germany?
they designed the flying wing, right? So, as I write in Area 51, you know, there was this search for all the different top Nazis that were developing weapons and weapon systems for the Reich. And the Horton brothers were among them. And they disappeared, they went to South America, they designed the flying wing, and if you look at pictures side by side of the flying wing and the B-2 bomber, I mean,
It's very similar, right?
they just, you're like, oh, intellectual property theft, right?
Oh wow, that bad.
Yeah,
Steve,
Yeah.
pull up the
Yeah.
there you go.
right. And then
Horton. Type in
Horton flying wing.
Yeah, Horton Flying Wing. And then there was some sort of story. There was a story in Area 51 where somebody went to interview the Horton brothers, and they were like, "Any questions about CIA? We will not say a word about CIA."
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that was?
I mean, my theory on a lot of this is that time reveals all things. There's a quote that I start the Area 51 book with that I'm forgetting right now, but by the old Greek philosopher Horace, and it's exactly that like that which is hidden inevitably gets revealed. And I think that what's so interesting being a reporter, writing about nonfiction as I do, and others, like Tom O'Neill, who's been on your show, who's a friend of mine, right? You just start to you're peeling back layers of this enigmatic system of secrets, and why, and it's like a ball of yarn. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's certainly the case with UFOs. I mean, you could almost say the Horton brothers are the origin story, I believe, of ufology. Flying saucers, right? They actually created a aircraft that looks exactly like a flying saucer. I have a picture of it in the Area 51 book. It's a circular,
I listened to the audio, I didn't
Yeah.
see photos.
So this is like, and then what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right?
Yeah. What can we find a picture of it? I would love to see it. Horton Brothers Flying Saucer, Area 51. We can find it online, you think?
Yeah, there it is, right there. The national. They took the. Yeah.
Is that it right there?
That's from my book. Yes.
Oh, wow.
That I got at the National Archives.
Well, that doesn't really look like a flying saucer. I guess from one angle it does.
No, the one right here. The one wing. The one wing.
Oh, that.
Down below, right here. No.
Where are we pointing at?
Yeah. See, it says Arrow Stories.
Oh
Horton
my
Brothers.
God,
Two brothers,
that
one
thing
wing.
is
Yeah.
so futuristic looking. It's
Right?
crazy.
I mean, that was 1941 or 2, right?
Right.
I mean, the thing that I think is interesting is like that the human mind can write the narrative that it needs to, right? So if you want to believe, then you write that. And when I say write, I mean that, figuratively, not necessarily literally. You're reverse engineering from this idea of, aliens exist or UFOs exist, right? And then everything leans toward that and fills that narrative in. And if you're on the other side of it and you are suspicious of that, everything. I mean, look, I learned when I was on my first book, Area 51. I learned about this concept from officers of the CIA and there are two forms of strategic deception.
Yes.
Okay, there is cover, right, and that's to essentially have a cover story, like information.
Like Billy Wall jogging through
Exactly.
cartoon.
That's right. That's one kind of strategic deception. But the other kind is misinformation, right? And so and the example I use in the Area 51 book was a bunch of the Lockheed engineers were heading out to Area 51 to work on the U-2 spy plane. This is in the middle of the 50s. And of course, it was the most classified project, or one of them, that existed at the time, right? I mean, the Soviets could not know we were building a spy plane that could fly 70,000 feet in the air above where their surface-to-air missiles could shoot them down, for the purposes of spying on the Soviet Union to find out what was going on below, right? That's what the U-2 was. It was just absolutely this ingenious idea of like aerial espionage. That is the origin story, the birth of it, right? So it's so top secret. And they all get on the plane, and the plane crashes into Mount Charleston. And everyone's dead.
Oh yeah, there was one guy who missed the flight,
Yeah,
right?
that I interviewed, Bob Murphy. Yeah. Got drunk and missed the flight. Right?
Can you imagine the guilt?
Right? And so they're all dead, and then the CIA is like, oh shit, our program's gonna be exposed. It's this like,
Right.
you know, all the reporters are taking off up to get up the road, and they cut off the road so you can't get up there, but still it's gonna leak out. And then the press reports a story that they were all scientists working on a secret atomic bomb out at Nevada test site. And, you know, the CIA's like, no comment, right? In this sort of mysterious way. And they're like, see, it is. And then, so there you have disinformation, right? It's just like, and a lot of times what the agency does, in my experience, my understanding from people explaining this to me, and from reporting stories and looking at history, is they use the public's perception, or what you could say the public's gullibility in some cases. And they use that to their advantage. You know, sometimes it spirals out of control and they can't control it. But often, strategic deception is part of is how the public reacts to something, right?
And one of the most eye-opening stories to me is how these, I think there were CIA pilots that were testing like the first jet airplane, the first fighter jet over Nevada. They would bring gorilla masks in the cockpit with them. So if another pilot came within a visual distance, they'd put on their gorilla mask. That way, when this guy goes to dinner with some buddies or goes to the bar, no one's gonna believe he saw a gorilla flying a jet plane. That is bizarre, and that's so similar. I mean, it makes perfect sense in Bob Lazar's story. If he's going to work on some shit and they put a little alien dummy in the window to make it seem like, okay, no one's gonna believe Bob Lazar if he says he saw an alien. But that kind of backfires because a lot of people do believe that.
And again, it depends what camp you're in. That that story will work for your story, right? Which makes it all very interesting. It's why I will never I mean, I know my position. I really believe that the whole hoo-ha about all of this is part of a major strategic deception campaign.
What's going on right now?
Yes, and it has been going on since 1947, since the CIA was created. I mean, you can read in Area 51 the original concern of then CIA Director Walter Beadle Smith, right? His concern with this UFO, I mean, I quote the documents from the archives, right? That it's going to cause a problem. And we need to use this. You know, I'm paraphrasing again, but this was happening in 1947, and you can just chart, or at least I can, how this is a repeating story. Now, many people, take me to task over that, and I've interviewed for my book Phenomena many of the individuals who are at the fore of this thrust to say that the U.S. government is hiding alien technology. Now,
What do you think? Sorry, go ahead.
well, to me, it's and I've interviewed all of them, and I've written about what they have told me and their opinions about things. And so, do they change their mind? Are they part of the strategic deception campaign? Are some of them? I mean, excuse me, I sit back and look from afar. That's maybe my Tom O'Neill Chaos book. That's the 20-year, side reporting, because it just keeps building, and people continue to contact me about this and that, and it just gets more and more interesting. And also, as the science and technology grows, right, now you have threaded into all of this these new issues about DNA, about things that didn't exist. Well, they certainly existed, but that didn't exist within the narrative 60, 70 years ago. Right?
What about DNA?
Being in this idea that people that have experiences are different and they have different DNA. I mean, I get into that in the end of Phenomena, but
That's the one I haven't read yet.
yeah. I mean, I'm a storyteller. I'm a reporter, and I'm a storyteller, and I'm really interested in stories. And I'm really interested in how people, how you live your life. And, Joan Didion said, we tell ourselves stories to live, right?
Right.
And
An explosive
also,
blast
many
can
of
and
the
will kill
people I
many
know
helpers.
that are involved in that world have had what are called near-death experiences, right?
In the phenomenon.
Yeah, and if you've had a near-death experience, to my eye, you
is
are
most
in a
generous
different
gift. I am
category of
grateful.
human being, right? Because you've had an experience that others simply can't relate to, right? And I'm talking about like particularly in war, most of the people I know that have shared with me, they're really intense, like I should have died story, right?
Right.
That's really intense.
Yes.
That's an experience that, right, is going to change your thinking, right?
I have a lot I want to ask you about
Yeah.
that, but I want to stay on the UFOs for a second. If
I thought we were going back to paperclip.
First, we got to do surprise, kill, vanish. Then we got to go back to. If you were to decide to start writing a book about the whole UFO phenomenon in America right now, and you were to start interviewing all your sources, do you think you'd get the real story?
I wouldn't write that book because that's opinion. And I don't want to write opinion. I do write, here's this document, here's that
There's
document.
no documents. That's the thing. There's
There
no
are,
hard.
absolutely.
There's no hard evidence.
And I think that's the long quest, ultimately. And I also build trust with people who sit in that world, right? And in my experience also,
Like Russian doll, but instead
as
of
people
smaller
get
monkey inside,
older
there is only
and they
grenade.
come closer to
Very
meeting
funny.
the maker, their perspective shifts on what is important and what they want to share and tell. And I think that's really interesting, in a completely legitimate way, right? I mean, even the nuclear war book, like getting someone like Leon Panetta to go on record with me, getting some of the elder statesmen that I did. Why? Because they have grandchildren. Because they, as one of them said to me, we thought we had this covered, like, oh, we'd get through the Cold War with all these nukes. At one point, we had 30,000 nukes. 30,000 nuclear warheads.
And China had how many? They had like pretty close to that, right?
No, Russia.
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 They had in the 20s.
Russia had the same. Russia's always essentially, once we became equals in the early 50s, then, it's been the same. So they had 30,000 too. Today we have 5,000. They have 5,000. That's 1,700 of which are on ready for launch status. Meaning
So out of 5,000, 1,700 are ready for launch.
Ready for
They
launch.
could go in a matter of
they
seconds.
can go. I mean, some of them have to come out of the hangars for the bombers, but the 400 ICBMs in missile silos take 60 seconds. That's why they call them Minutemen. Right? The submarine-launched ballistic missiles,
That just gives me chills.
the
thinking about submarines.
handmaidens of the apocalypse. Right? And so, as people get older that have had access to super classified
material.
I think, coupled with the fact of how rapidly the world is actually just changing culturally, scientifically, right? People feel the need to share stories, to share information, not to like spill the beans on national security, but just more of the people that I find interesting. It's like more they want to tell their narrative. They want to tell why I'm telling this. Right? And then it becomes a cautionary tale, or perhaps it becomes a way for,
Maybe leave the world a better place.
or to reframe how we think about things. You know, I mean, the clearest, sort of most obvious immediacy of that is these 80-year-old elder statesmen who've worked in nuclear command and control all their lives saying, People cannot think that using a tactical nuclear weapon is anything short of madness. You know, because you hear
Yeah, they
people
talk about
today.
it. They talk about it with Ukraine, and
Right.
it is you gotta hand it to humanity that for all of the atrocities we've committed, we haven't dropped one since the late 40s. Like it's amazing that we have not.
Having studied this area, I now believe it's because the people in control, in command and control, they have seen the nuclear war games. They know this can never be done. And
Just everybody, or just the U.S.?
in the U.S., in the
Okay,
U.S.,
okay.
right? With the weird exception being the president. I think that was one of the most shocking things I learned in this book was a number of people explaining to me how. Okay, because we have what is called sole authority. So the President of the United States can launch.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Bubs. I've recently gotten into collagen supplementation because after the age of 25, your natural collagen production dramatically drops off, which severely impacts your skin. By supplementing with collagen, you're actually increasing your body's natural production of collagen. This increases your skin health, your skin elasticity, which improves the overall quality of your skin. Secondly, if you're someone who's into lifting heavy weights, collagen is one of the major building blocks to joint and connective tissue. Collagen protein can help reduce joint inflammation and improve joint function. And finally, collagen is amazing for your hair growth because it increases the production of keratin, helping to promote stronger, healthier hair. Bubs is a tribute company to Glenn Bubs Doran, who was a Navy SEAL and CIA contractor who died defending American freedom in Benghazi, Libya. Nutrition as a dig mixing promo code Bubs Nacho.
Okay, sure doesn't need
Code DJP.